Black pilot is denied first class. What happens next leaves passengers stunned. The moment the flight attendant stepped in front of Captain Marcus Reed, the cabin fell silent. Passengers watched as she blocked his path to the first-class cabin. "Excuse me, sir," she said with an icy tone. "This area is for first-class passengers only." Marcus's dark brown skin and pilot's uniform, complete with shiny captain's wings pinned to his chest, should have spoken for themselves. Yet her eyes held doubt. "I am a first-class passenger," Marcus replied, voice calm but firm. "In fact, I'm the pilot of this flight." The attendant blinked, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't move. Instead, her voice grew louder as she addressed him. "Sir, I need to see your boarding pass. We have strict policies about unauthorized access." Gasps rippled through the cabin as people whispered. A man sitting near the aisle muttered, "What's going on here?" Marcus glanced at the rows of watching eyes. He didn't need a boarding pass to prove his authority, and the insinuation was clear. "Ma'am," Marcus began, his tone now edged with steel. "I suggest you check with the cockpit if you're unsure of who I am." Before she could respond, a voice rang out. "He doesn't need to prove anything." A woman in business attire stood up, her voice shaking with outrage. "That's Captain Reed. I've seen him fly this route before." The flight attendant faltered, but before she could reply, a new figure emerged from the cockpit, a co-pilot wearing the same uniform as Marcus. What the co-pilot said next shocked the entire cabin, leaving the passengers stunned and the story at its boiling point. Marcus had known the day wouldn't be easy the moment he stepped into the airport. Flying commercial for once instead of piloting the plane, he expected a smoother experience. His career had taken him to the skies for over 15 years, but today he was just another passenger heading to see his family in Atlanta. Dressed in his captain's uniform for convenience, pilots often travel in uniform for respect and quick identification. Marcus had breezed through security. Some travelers had smiled at him. Others gave polite nods. But one TSA officer had scrutinized his ID card longer than necessary, asking more questions than usual. Marcus chalked it up to a bad morning and let it slide. At the boarding gate, he presented his first-class ticket. The gate agent hesitated, glancing at his uniform, then his face, and finally his boarding pass. Her smile seemed forced as she handed it back. "Enjoy your flight," she said, though her tone lacked sincerity. Once on board, Marcus was greeted with the typical polite phrases, but the tension lingered. Passengers in the first-class section exchanged looks as he settled into his seat. He ignored it, focusing on his phone to check emails. The calm atmosphere shifted when the flight attendant approached him after boarding was complete. Her voice was curt. "Sir, I believe you might be in the wrong seat." Marcus blinked. "No, this is my seat. 3A. The attendant's expression hardened. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Marcus handed it over, watching her eyes scan the ticket. She frowned but handed it back. "I see. Well, I'll let the crew know there's been a misunderstanding." Her words stung, but Marcus held his tongue. He had experienced moments like this before, being questioned about his credentials, his authority, and even his place in spaces he earned through hard work. Still, her implication that he didn't belong sat heavy in his chest. The flight was soon ready for takeoff. Marcus observed the attendants checking seatbelts and preparing the cabin. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus decided to stretch his legs and check in with the cockpit crew, a common courtesy among pilots. That's when the confrontation unfolded. Standing at the curtain separating first class and the rest of the cabin, Marcus had been stopped in his tracks by the same flight attendant who had questioned him earlier. Now, with passengers murmuring and phones recording the unfolding scene, the co-pilot's entrance added fuel to the fire. Marcus turned to face him, curious and bracing for what would come next. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone waited to see how it would unravel. The co-pilot stepped closer, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. He looked at Marcus and then at the flight attendant who had blocked his path. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp enough to command attention. The flight attendant hesitated. This gentleman claimed to be the pilot, but I needed to confirm. He didn't have his boarding pass ready. The co-pilot's eyes narrowed. That's Captain Marcus Reed, he said firmly, gesturing to Marcus. He's one of the most experienced captains we have. He's been flying longer than you've probably been working here. The attendant's face flushed, and she fumbled for words. I didn't know. I was just following protocol. Protocol? Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but steady. You questioned me in front of the entire cabin when I'm in uniform, and I already showed you my ticket. This isn't about protocol. The murmurs grew louder. A man in the economy section called out, Why'd you stop him? You didn't question anyone else. Another voice chimed in, This is unacceptable. The co-pilot raised his hands to calm the growing uproar. Captain Reed, I'm sorry you had to deal with this. Let me escort you to the cockpit. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also wasn't about to let it slide. Thank you, he said, nodding to the co-pilot. He turned back to the flight attendant, his eyes locking with hers. I hope you reflect on how you handled this. The co-pilot led Marcus past the curtain and into the cockpit, where the pilot greeted him warmly. Captain Reed, good to see you, the senior pilot said, shaking his hand. We've got everything under control here, but feel free to stay and chat. Marcus smiled faintly, but his mind was elsewhere. He could still hear the murmurs from the cabin, the voices of passengers calling out for justice. His chest tightened, not just from the confrontation, but from the deeper truth it revealed. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such bias, and he doubted it would be the last. The rest of the flight carried on uneventfully, but the energy in the cabin remained tense. The flight attendant avoided making eye contact with Marcus, focusing her attention on other passengers. Marcus kept to himself, mentally replaying the incident. He was used to handling high-pressure situations in the air, but this felt different. This was personal. As the plane landed in Atlanta, Marcus expected the incident to fade away. He was wrong. After disembarking, Marcus was approached by a group of passengers near the baggage claim. The woman who had stood up for him earlier led the way. Captain Reed, can we talk for a moment? Marcus paused, surprised. Of course. What's on your mind? I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened back there, she said, her voice filled with emotion. It was wrong, and I want to make sure it doesn't happen again. Another passenger, a younger man with a camera bag slung over his shoulder, chimed in. I recorded everything. People need to see how you were treated. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. I appreciate the support, but I'm not sure going public with this will solve anything. It might just make things worse. The woman shook her head. No. This needs to be addressed. You've worked too hard to deal with this kind of treatment. Marcus nodded, but before he could respond, a voice called out from behind him. Captain Reed. He turned to see the flight attendant from earlier. She looked nervous, clutching her purse tightly. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you. Marcus held up a hand. Stop. Don't apologize unless you mean it. The attendant blinked, her cheeks reddening. I do mean it. I realize now how I came across, and I feel terrible. Marcus studied her face, searching for sincerity. Apologies are a start, he said slowly. But what's more important is that you change how you treat people moving forward. She nodded, her eyes glistening. I will, I promise. Before Marcus could say more, the younger man with the camera bag spoke up. Captain, what are you going to do now? Are you going to report this? Marcus hesitated, caught between wanting to move on and feeling the weight of accountability. Just as he opened his mouth to respond, a loud voice boomed from across the terminal. Captain Reed, over here. Marcus turned to see a news crew approaching, cameras rolling and microphones ready. The group of passengers exchanged uneasy glances as the reporters closed in. Marcus braced himself for another confrontation, unsure of what would happen next. The news crew swarmed toward Marcus like a tidal wave, microphones extended and cameras capturing every detail. The lead reporter, a tall man with a crisp suit and sharp features, spoke first. "Captain Reed, we've received reports of an incident on your flight. Can you confirm what happened?" Marcus glanced at the group of passengers who had stood up for him. Their supportive nods gave him the courage to address the situation, even though every instinct told him to walk away. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "There was a misunderstanding on board," Marcus began, choosing his words carefully. "As a pilot, I often travel in uniform, and today I was traveling as a passenger. Unfortunately, I was mistaken for someone who didn't belong in first class." The reporter pressed further. "Mistaken because of your uniform, or because of something else?" His tone was probing, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew the answer but didn't want to stoke the flames recklessly. "I can't speak to the intentions behind it," he replied, his voice steady. "But the way it unfolded raises questions that need to be addressed, not just for me but for others who face similar situations." Passengers from the flight began chiming in, adding their perspectives. The businesswoman who had stood up for Marcus spoke firmly. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination, plain and simple. He showed his ticket, he was in uniform, and yet he was treated as though he didn't belong." The younger man with the camera bag held up his phone. "I'd recorded the whole thing. People need to see what happened so this doesn't just get swept under the rug." The flight attendant who had approached Marcus earlier stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable. She raised a hand to get the reporter's attention. "I've already apologized to Captain Reed," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, and I'll learn from it." The reporter turned back to Marcus. "Captain Reed, do you plan to take any action against the airline or the staff involved?" Marcus hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision. He didn't want to be vindictive, but ignoring the issue felt wrong. "I haven't decided yet," he admitted. "My focus is on ensuring that incidents like this are taken seriously, so no one else has to experience it." Before the reporter could ask another question, an airline representative appeared, flanked by security personnel. The representative, a middle-aged man with a polished demeanor, approached Marcus directly. "Captain Reed, may I have a word with you in private?" The tension in the group spiked as Marcus followed the man to a quieter corner of the terminal. The representative introduced himself as Mr. Harper, a senior manager for the airline. "First of all, I want to extend my personal apologies for what happened on your flight. This is not how we operate." Marcus crossed his arms. "It shouldn't have happened at all, Mr. Harper. Apologies only go so far." "I understand," Harper said, nodding. "We're taking this matter very seriously. The employee involved will undergo additional training, and we'd like to offer you compensation for the inconvenience." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Compensation? You think money is going to fix this?" Harper held up his hands. "I'm not trying to dismiss the seriousness of the situation. We want to show you that we value your role as a captain and your loyalty to our airline." Marcus sighed. "What I value is accountability and real change. This isn't just about me. What about the passengers who saw what happened? What message does this send to them?" Harper hesitated, clearly unprepared for Marcus's response. "We're committed to addressing this at all levels," he said finally. "If there's anything specific you'd like us to do, I'm here to listen." Marcus thought for a moment. "I want a public acknowledgement from the airline. Not a generic apology, but a real statement about how incidents like this are unacceptable. And I want to know what steps you're taking to ensure it doesn't happen again." Harper nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do." As Marcus returned to the group, he noticed the crowd of passengers had grown. People were talking in hushed tones, and the energy in the air was electric. The younger man with the camera approached him again. "Captain, if you're okay with it, I'd like to share the video I recorded. It's powerful, and I think it could make a difference." Marcus hesitated. Going public with the footage could spark a firestorm. It could lead to much-needed change, but it could also bring unwanted attention and backlash. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a text from his wife, Dana. "How's your flight?" The kids are waiting to see you. Love you." Marcus smiled faintly, reminded of why he had taken this trip in the first place. Family. Grounding himself in that thought, he turned back to the young man. "Let me think about it," he said. "This isn't just about me, it's bigger than that." As the group began to disperse, Marcus thought the day was finally winding down. But as he stepped outside the terminal to catch a ride home, a commotion erupted nearby. Shouts echoed through the air, and Marcus turned to see a group of protesters holding signs and chanting slogans about equality and justice. At the center of the group, one sign stood out: "We stand with Captain Reed." Marcus froze, stunned. How had the news traveled so fast? He hadn't even made a decision about going public, yet here were strangers rallying in his name. The weight of the moment hit him like a wave, and he realized this was far from over. The story wasn't just his anymore. It was everyone's. And what happened next would set the stage for the fight ahead. Marcus stood on the curb, caught between disbelief and a growing sense of responsibility. The protesters were loud and organized, holding signs and chanting slogans like "Justice for Captain Reed" and "No more discrimination." People were recording with their phones, and more onlookers began to gather, turning the scene into a full-blown spectacle. One of the protesters, a young woman with a megaphone, spotted Marcus and shouted, "There he is. Captain Reed is here." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, their enthusiasm catching Marcus off guard. He hadn't asked for any of this, and yet it was happening. His story had become a movement overnight. The woman with the megaphone rushed over, her eyes bright with determination. "Captain Reed, my name is Angela Carter. I run a grassroots organization called Equity Aid in Action. We heard what happened on your flight, and we couldn't stay silent." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. He wasn't sure how to navigate this situation. "I appreciate your support," he said carefully. "But I didn't organize this, and I'm not sure what your goals are." Angela smiled warmly. "Our goal is simple: to make sure stories like yours lead to real change. You're not alone in this fight, Captain Reed." Before Marcus could reply, another voice cut through the crowd. "Captain Reed, over here." A man in a dark suit and sunglasses stepped forward, his demeanor calm but authoritative. He introduced himself as Detective Nathan Cross from the airport police. "We've been monitoring the situation, Captain. Is there anything you'd like to say or do to de-escalate this?" Marcus frowned, feeling the pressure of being thrust into the spotlight. "I didn't ask for any of this," he admitted. "I was just trying to get home to my family." Detective Cross nodded. "I understand, sir. But the situation has gained a lot of attention, and it's important to handle it carefully." Angela stepped closer, her voice firm but respectful. "With all due respect, Detective, this isn't a disruption. This is a peaceful demonstration for justice." The detective's gaze shifted between Angela and Marcus. "I'm not here to shut it down," he said. "I'm here to make sure it stays peaceful." Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind racing. The weight of the crowd's expectations pressed heavily on him. He hadn't planned to take a stand, but walking away now felt like turning his back on something bigger than himself. He stepped forward, raising a hand to address the crowd. The cheers quieted into an expectant silence. "I want to thank all of you for showing up," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves knotting his stomach. "I never imagined something like this would happen, and I didn't ask for it. But now that we're here, I think it's important to have a real conversation about what needs to change." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy bolstering Marcus's resolve. He continued, "This isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who faced similar treatment, but didn't have witnesses or a platform to speak out. If we're going to do this, let's do it the right way, with respect and purpose." Angela raised her megaphone. "You heard the man. This isn't just a protest. It's a call for action." The crowd cheered again, their enthusiasm unwavering. Later that evening, Marcus finally made it home. His wife, Dana, greeted him at the door with a tight hug. "I saw the news," she said softly. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, though his exhaustion was evident. I'm fine. Just trying to process everything. Their two kids, Maya and Jordan, ran up to hug him, their excitement a welcome distraction. "Daddy, you're famous," Jordan said, grinning. "We saw you on TV." Marcus chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "I wouldn't call it famous, buddy." Dana ushered the kids to the kitchen, giving Marcus a moment to breathe. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "what happens now?" Marcus leaned against the wall, his shoulders heavy. "I don't know, part of me wants to move on, but this has become bigger than I ever imagined." Dana placed a hand on his arm, her voice gentle but firm. "You've always taught our kids to stand up for what's right. Maybe this is your chance to show them what that looks like." Marcus sighed, knowing she was right. "I just don't want to make things worse." "You won't," Dana said, squeezing his arm. "You've already made an impact. Now it's about deciding how far you want to take it." The next day, Marcus received a call from Mr. Harper, the airline representative he'd spoken with at the airport. "Captain Reed," Harper began, his tone cautious, "I wanted to follow up on our conversation. The airline is prepared to issue a public apology and outline the steps we're taking to address this issue." Marcus listened intently. "What steps, exactly?" Harper hesitated before replying. "Mandatory training for all staff or review of our protocols, and a public commitment to diversity and inclusion." It was a start, but Marcus wasn't convinced. "Words are easy, Mr. Harper. Actions are harder. I need to see real accountability." "We're open to your input," Harper said. "If there's anything specific you'd like us to address, we're willing to work with you." Marcus considered his options. He could push for deeper changes or accept the airline's efforts as enough. Before he could decide, his phone buzzed with another call. It was Angela. "Captain Reed," she said, her voice brimming with urgency. "I just got word that the video from the flight has gone viral. This is blowing up faster than we expected." Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the pressure mount. "What does that mean for us?" "It means the world is watching," Angela replied, "and they're waiting to see what you'll do next." That evening, Marcus sat in his living room, scrolling through the flood of messages and news coverage on his phone. Headlines ranged from Black Pilot Denied First-Class Sparks Outrage to Airline Faces Backlash for Discrimination. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForCaptain Reed and #FlyFair. As he read through the comments, some supportive, others skeptical, Marcus realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could step back and let the story fade, or he could step forward and use his voice to demand real change. Just as he was beginning to formulate a plan, his phone buzzed with yet another notification. This time, it wasn't a message or a news alert. It was a direct email from the CEO of the airline. The subject line read, "A personal request to meet." Marcus stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He opened the email, reading the short but significant message. "Dear Captain Reed, I'd like to meet with you in person to discuss the incident and hear your perspective directly. Please let me know when you're available. Sincerely, David Langston, CEO, Skyways Airlines." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the gravity of the moment sinking in. The stakes were higher than ever, and he knew the next steps would define not just his story but the message it sent to countless others. The decision weighed heavy on his mind as he prepared to reply, knowing that whatever he chose, it would lead to a turning point he couldn't predict. Marcus took a deep breath, rereading the email from David Langston, the CEO of Skyways Airlines. He felt a mix of apprehension and determination. This was an opportunity to address the issue at the highest level, but it also came with risks. After a moment of reflection, he typed a reply. "Mr. Langston, thank you for reaching out. I'm available to meet tomorrow at your convenience. Let me know the time and location. Best regards, Captain Marcus Reed." He hit send and closed his laptop. Marcus leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow's meeting could either be a step toward meaningful change or a calculated move by the airline to control the narrative. Either way, he needed to be prepared. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Skyways Airlines corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. The sleek glass building reflected the city skyline and the lobby buzzed with activity. Marcus was greeted by a polite assistant who escorted him to a private conference room on the top floor. David Langston entered moments later, a tall man with a commanding presence. He extended a hand to Marcus. "Captain Reed, thank you for coming on such short notice." Marcus shook his hand. "Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Langston. I'm here because this issue is too important to ignore." Langston nodded, gesturing for Marcus to take a seat. "I agree. That's why I wanted to speak with you directly. Let me start by saying I was appalled when I learned about the incident. It's unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the values we strive for as a company." Marcus listened, his expression neutral. "I appreciate your words, but this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Maybe not on this scale, but it's a systemic issue. Apologies and promises aren't enough anymore." Langston leaned forward, his tone serious. "That's exactly why I want your input. You've been with this airline for years, and your perspective as a black pilot is invaluable. I want to hear what you think we need to do to fix this." Marcus hesitated, surprised by the CEO's openness. He hadn't expected to be asked for solutions, but he had plenty of ideas. "For starters," Marcus said, "you need to implement mandatory anti-bias training, not just a one-time seminar, but ongoing programs that address both conscious and unconscious biases." Langston nodded, jotting down notes. "Go on." "You also need to increase diversity in leadership," Marcus continued. "Representation matters. If your leadership team doesn't reflect the diversity of your employees and passengers, it sends the wrong message." Langston set down his pen. "I agree, but those kinds of changes take time. What can we do immediately to rebuild trust?" Marcus thought for a moment. "A public commitment. Not just an apology, but a detailed plan outlining the steps you're taking to address discrimination and foster inclusion. And I'd like to see an independent review of your policies and practices to ensure accountability." Langston leaned back, considering Marcus's words. "That's a bold ask, but it's fair. I'll discuss it with the board, but I think we can make it happen. In the meantime, I'd like to offer you a role on our Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Panel. You'd help guide these initiatives and ensure we're making real progress." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected such a direct offer. "I'll need time to think about that," he said honestly. "Of course," Langston replied. "Take as much time as you need." As Marcus left the headquarters, his phone buzzed with a call from Angela. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice brimming with curiosity. "It went better than I expected," Marcus admitted. "The CEO seemed serious about making changes. He even offered me a position on their advisory panel." "That's huge," Angela exclaimed. "But you should be cautious. Companies love to make promises when they're under public scrutiny. The real question is whether they'll follow through." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I'm not rushing into anything. But if I do take the role, I'll make sure it's not just window dressing." Angela paused and said, "The video from the flight has hit 1 million views. People are paying attention, Marcus. This is bigger than the airline. It's about changing the way we think about equity in all spaces." Marcus sighed. "I'm starting to realize that." That evening, Marcus sat with his wife, Dana, discussing the day's events. "Do you think I should take the advisory panel position?" he asked. Dana sipped her tea, considering his question. "It sounds like a good opportunity, but only if they're willing to listen to you and make real changes. If it's just for show, it could hurt your credibility." "That's my worry," Marcus admitted. "But if I don't take it, I might miss the chance to influence meaningful change." Dana placed a hand on his. "You've always trusted your instincts, Marcus. Whatever you decide, I know you'll do what's right." The next morning, Marcus woke to another flood of notifications. One headline stood out: "Airline CEO meets with black pilot after first-class incident. Is change coming?" The story detailed his meeting with Langston, though the specifics of their discussion hadn't been disclosed. Scrolling further, Marcus found another video, a snippet of the protesters outside the airport chanting his name. The video was captioned, "The movement grows. Justice for Captain Reed." As Marcus watched, his phone buzzed with a text from Langston. Good morning, Captain Reed. The board has approved your recommendations. We'll be releasing a public statement later today. Thank you for your leadership. Marcus stared at the message, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. This was progress, but it was only the beginning. He knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he felt hope that real change was possible. Just as he began to draft a reply, another notification popped up, this time an anonymous email with the subject line, "You're being watched." Marcus opened the email, his heart pounding as he read the chilling message, "Back off, or there will be consequences." His hands tightened around his phone. The stakes had just been raised, and Marcus realized that the fight for justice wasn't just about policies or public statements. It was about standing firm even when the opposition grew dangerous. Marcus stared at the email, the words, "Back off, or there will be consequences," burning into his mind. His breath quickened and his hands trembled as he gripped his phone. He read the message again, hoping it would somehow change on the second pass. It didn't. Who would send this? He muttered under his breath. He felt a mix of anger and fear, his thoughts racing. Was this someone from the airline? A random online troll? Or worse, someone serious about following through? His wife, Dana, walked into the room, noticing his tense posture. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern etched on her face. Marcus hesitated, unsure if he should burden her with this. But Dana had always been his rock, and keeping her in the dark didn't feel right. "I just got this," he said, handing her the phone. Dana read the message, her eyes widening. "What the—" "Marcus, this is serious. You need to report this." Marcus nodded. "I will." "But to who? The police? The airline? This could be anyone." Dana grabbed his hand, her grip firm. "Start with the police. If someone's trying to intimidate you, they need to know they can't scare you into silence." Marcus took a deep breath, her words grounding him. "You're right. I'll report it. But I'm not backing down." Later that morning, Marcus visited the local police station. Detective Nathan Cross, the same officer who had monitored the protest, happened to be on duty. He greeted Marcus with a firm handshake. "Captain Reed, good to see you again. What brings you here?" Marcus showed him the email. "This came through this morning. I don't know who sent it, but I'm taking it seriously." Detective Cross read the message, his expression darkening. "You're right to report this. Threats like these can escalate, and it's better to be cautious. Do you have any idea who might have sent it?" Marcus shook his head. It could be anyone, someone upset about the protest, someone from the airline, or just a random person online. Cross nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll start by tracing the email's origin. It might take some time, but we'll do everything we can. In the meantime, stay vigilant. If you notice anything unusual, strange calls, people following you, let us know immediately." Marcus thanked the detective and left the station feeling slightly more reassured, though the unease lingered. That afternoon, the airline released its public statement. It was a polished video featuring CEO David Langston, who spoke directly to the camera with a tone of sincerity. "At Skyways Airlines, we are committed to creating a safe and inclusive environment for all passengers and employees. Recently, an incident occurred involving one of our most esteemed pilots, Captain Marcus Reed, that did not reflect our values. We take full responsibility and are taking immediate steps to address the situation." Langston went on to outline the changes Marcus had recommended: mandatory anti-bias training, increased diversity in leadership, and a third-party review of company policies. The statement ended with a personal apology to Marcus and a pledge to rebuild trust. As Marcus watched the video, his phone buzzed with messages of support. Angela called shortly after. "Marcus, that statement was huge. People are already talking about how this could set a new standard for the industry." Marcus sighed. "It's a step in the right direction, but it's just the beginning. Words are easy. Actions are harder." Angela paused. "You're right. But this wouldn't have happened without you standing up. Don't lose sight of that." For the next few days, Marcus tried to focus on his family and his upcoming flights, but the email weighed heavily on him. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was another threat. One evening, as he sat on the couch with Dana, the doorbell rang. Marcus frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. Who could that be? Dana stood up. "I'll get it." Marcus followed her to the door, his unease growing. When Dana opened it, there was no one there. But a package sat on the doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper. The label read simply, "To Captain Reed." Marcus's stomach tightened. "Don't touch it," he said, stepping in front of Dana. He carefully picked up the package, examining it. There was no return address, just his name. "This doesn't feel right." "What do you think it is?" Dana asked, her voice trembling. Marcus shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm not opening it here." He grabbed his phone and called Detective Cross. "I just received a suspicious package at my house," he said. "Can you send someone to check it out?" "Stay where you are," Cross replied. "We'll send a unit right away." When the police arrived, they carefully examined the package. After ensuring it was safe to open, they revealed its contents. A single piece of paper with the words, "This is your final warning." Marcus felt his blood run cold. The anonymous email had been bad enough, but this was different. It was personal, deliberate, and meant to intimidate him. Detective Cross placed a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We'll increase patrols around your neighborhood and step up our investigation. Whoever's behind this wants you to feel powerless, but don't let them win." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. "I won't. If they think they can scare me into silence, they've got another thing coming." The next morning, Marcus sat in his living room, staring out the window as the sun rose. He thought about his family, the passengers who had stood up for him, and the countless others who looked to him as a symbol of change. The fight was bigger than he had imagined, and the stakes were higher than he had anticipated. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He opened his laptop and began drafting a public statement of his own, a message to those who supported him and to those who sought to silence him. As he typed, he thought about the journey ahead, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. Just as he finished his draft, his phone buzzed with a notification. This time it wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. A national news program wanted to feature his story in a live interview. Marcus stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the decision. Accepting the invitation would put him in the spotlight like never before, but it could also amplify his message to a wider audience. He took a deep breath and began typing his reply, knowing that this next step would take the fight to a whole new level. Marcus's reply to the national news program was brief but decisive. "I'm in. Let me know the details." The response came quickly, and within hours, plans were finalized. The interview would air live the next evening, giving Marcus little time to prepare. Still, he felt ready. If he was going to step into the spotlight, he would do it on his terms. The next day, Marcus arrived at the studio in downtown Atlanta. The atmosphere was buzzing with activity, producers barking instructions into headsets, cameramen adjusting their equipment, and makeup artists touching up the host's appearance. Marcus was escorted to a green room, where he was handed a microphone and briefed on the format of the interview. The host, Linda Adams, was known for her incisive questions and calm demeanor. She entered the room to greet Marcus before the show. "Captain Reed, it's an honor to have you here," she said, extending her hand. "The honor's mine," Marcus replied, shaking her hand. "Thanks for giving me this platform." Linda smiled. "Your story has struck a chord with so many people. Let's make sure we do it justice." As Marcus waited for the live segment to begin, he thought about what he wanted to say. This wasn't just about recounting the incident. It was about highlighting the broader issues it represented. He rehearsed a few key points in his head, determined to make every word count. The interview began with a short introduction from Linda, setting the stage for Marcus's story. She then turned to him, her expression empathetic but focused. "Captain Reed, thank you for joining us. Let's start with the incident itself. What went through your mind when the flight attendant questioned your presence in first class?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. In that moment, I wasn't just thinking about myself. I was thinking about all the people who've been made to feel like they don't belong, despite having every right to be where they are. What happened to me wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of deeper biases that exist in our society. Linda nodded. You've been praised for the grace and composure you displayed during the incident. But some have questioned whether this was blown out of proportion. How would you respond to those critics? Marcus took a deep breath. I understand why some people might see it that way. But the truth is, incidents like this happen every day to people who don't have a platform to speak out. It's not just about one flight or one airline. It's about creating a culture where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. The interview continued, touching on the airline's response, the viral protests, and the changes Marcus had advocated for. But just as Marcus began to feel the conversation wrapping up, Linda posed a question that caught him off guard. Captain Reed, earlier today we received information about threats you've received since this story went public. Would you like to address those? Marcus paused, the studio falling silent. He hadn't planned to discuss the threats, but he realized this was an opportunity to take control of the narrative. Yes, I've received threats, he admitted. Some people don't want me to speak out, and they're trying to intimidate me into silence. But let me be clear, I won't back down. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel less than because of who they are. If we let fear stop us from fighting for what's right, nothing will ever change. The studio remained quiet for a beat before Linda spoke. That's incredibly powerful, Captain Reed. Thank you for your courage. After the interview, Marcus's phone lit up with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers who had watched the segment. Many praised his bravery and thanked him for speaking out. But as he scrolled through the flood of notifications, one message stood out, a text from an unknown number. It read, "You're making a mistake. You've been warned." Marcus's heart sank. The threats weren't going away, and the more attention his story received, the more dangerous the opposition seemed to become. He immediately forwarded the message to Detective Cross, who replied within minutes, "We're on it. Stay alert, and let me know if you notice anything suspicious." Marcus sat back, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The fight was taking a toll, not just on him but on his family. He thought of Dana and the kids, and a pang of guilt shot through him. Was he putting them in danger by refusing to stay quiet? The next day, Marcus decided to take a drive to clear his head. As he navigated the winding roads outside Atlanta, he noticed a car behind him that seemed to be following too closely. He slowed down, letting the car pass, but it lingered. Unease crept over him. Marcus turned down a side road, hoping to lose the vehicle, but it followed him. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, his pulse quickening. Was this just coincidence, or was someone tailing him? He pulled into a gas station, parking near the entrance where security cameras were visible. The car drove past slowly, but didn't stop. Marcus caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, but couldn't make out any details. He stayed at the gas station for a few minutes, watching the road. When he felt it was safe, he drove home, his mind racing. Was this connected to the threats, or was he just being paranoid? That evening, Marcus shared the incident with Dana and Detective Cross. "We'll increase patrols near your house," Cross assured him. "But if you feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call 911. Dana was less composed. "Marcus, this is getting out of hand. What if these people come after us?" Marcus wrapped an arm around her. "I'll do everything I can to protect you and the kids, but I can't let them scare me into giving up. If we don't stand up to people like this, they'll keep winning." Dana nodded reluctantly, her fear evident. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure how he could keep it. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Marcus sat alone in the living room, staring at his laptop. His public statement had been drafted, and the live interview had gone well. But the threats felt like a dark cloud looming over everything. He opened his email to check for updates from Detective Cross, but froze when he saw a new message with no subject line. The email contained a single sentence: "You're being watched." Marcus immediately closed the laptop, his resolve hardening. Whoever was behind this wanted him to stop, to feel powerless and afraid. But Marcus refused to give them that satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning, and Marcus knew that the next move would have to be his. Marcus barely slept that night, the weight of the threats and the chilling email gnawing at him. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the blinds, he sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and staring at his laptop. He knew he had to act decisively. The threats weren't just attempts to intimidate, they were a test of his resolve. He drafted an email to Angela. "Angela, the threats haven't stopped, and now I'm being followed. It's clear this fight is making someone very uncomfortable. I want to double down, but I need a strategy. Can we meet today?" Angela's reply came within minutes. "Absolutely. Let's talk. My office at noon." Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The decision to push forward felt right, but the danger to his family lingered in his mind. Angela's office was a modest space tucked into a community center in Atlanta. The walls were lined with posters advocating for justice and equality, and the atmosphere buzzed with quiet determination. Angela greeted Marcus warmly, offering him a cup of tea before diving into the discussion. "Marcus," she began, "you've already brought this issue to national attention. But whoever is behind these threats clearly wants you to stop. What's your plan?" Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I want to keep pushing. I've been invited to speak at several events, and I'm considering taking the airline's offer to join their advisory panel. But I also need to address these threats head-on." Angela nodded. "We can help with that. My team has connections with legal experts and security consultants. We'll make sure you're protected." "Thank you," Marcus said. "But there's something else. I want to use this momentum to push for industry-wide changes, not just at Skyways. This problem goes beyond one airline." Angela's eyes lit up. "That's bold, but it's exactly what's needed. If we can build a coalition, pilots, flight attendants, passengers, we can demand federal regulations to address bias in the airline industry." Marcus felt a surge of determination. "Let's do it." As Marcus left Angela's office, his phone buzzed with a call from Detective Cross. "Captain Reed, we traced the email address used to send the threats," Cross said. "It was created using a public Wi-Fi network, so it's difficult to pinpoint who sent it. But we're not giving up." "Thanks for keeping me updated," Marcus replied. "Anything on the car that followed me yesterday?" "We're still reviewing security footage from the gas station," Cross said. "Stay vigilant, Captain. Whoever's behind this seems persistent." Marcus hung up, his frustration mounting. The investigation was moving slowly, and the threats were escalating. But he refused to let fear dictate his actions. That evening, Marcus attended a rally organized by Equity in Action. The event was held at a local park, where a large crowd gathered to hear speakers share stories of resilience and calls for justice. When Marcus took the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. He gripped the microphone, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "Thank you for being here," he began. "This fight isn't just about what happened to me. It's about making sure no one else has to experience what I did. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." The crowd cheered, their energy giving Marcus the strength to continue. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "But it starts with moments like this, when people come together to say, 'Enough is enough.'" As he stepped off the stage, Angela approached him, a proud smile on her face. "You're inspiring people, Marcus. That's the kind of leadership we need." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a new notification. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was a photo of his house. The caption read, "Nice rally. Don't forget what's at stake." Marcus's blood ran cold. The threat had crossed a line, targeting his family. He quickly showed Angela, who gasped in shock. "We need to act now," she said. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. It's a direct threat." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. He called Detective Cross, his voice urgent. "Detective, I just received a photo of my house. They're escalating." Cross's tone was grim. "I'll send a team to your house immediately. You and your family need to stay somewhere safe tonight." That night, Marcus, Dana, and their kids stayed at a hotel under police protection. The children were confused but too young to understand the full gravity of the situation. Marcus and Dana sat together in the dimly lit room, their hands entwined. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I never wanted to put you or the kids in danger." Dana shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. You're standing up for something that matters. But we need to be smart about this. Promise me you'll do whatever it takes to keep us safe." "I promise," Marcus said, his voice firm. "No matter what." The next morning, Marcus received a call from Langston, the CEO of Skyways Airlines. "Captain Reed, I heard about the threats," Langston said. "This is unacceptable. I've instructed our legal team to cooperate fully with the authorities." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about changing an industry." "I understand," Langston said. "I'd like to meet again to discuss how we can support your broader goals. Let me know when you're available." Marcus agreed, feeling the momentum building. The threats were a reminder of the risks, but they also underscored the importance of the fight. As he hung up, his phone buzzed with another notification. This time it was an invitation from a senator's office. They wanted Marcus to testify at a congressional hearing on systemic bias in the airline industry. Marcus stared at the screen, feeling a mix of pride and apprehension. This was a chance to take the fight to the highest level, but it also meant stepping into an even bigger spotlight with even greater risks. He took a deep breath and replied, "Yes, I'll be there." The stakes had never been higher, but Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. The days leading up to the congressional hearing were a whirlwind. Marcus spent hours preparing his testimony, working with Angela and a team of advocates to refine his message. This wasn't just about telling his story. It was about using his platform to demand concrete, systemic changes. Dana was supportive but worried. "Marcus, this is bigger than anything you've done before. Are you ready for the pressure?" He nodded, though anxiety gnawed at him. "I have to be. This is a chance to create real change." Meanwhile, Detective Cross called with updates. The investigation into the threats had hit another dead end. "Whoever's behind this is covering their tracks," Cross admitted. "But we're not giving up. Keep your security tight, and don't take any chances." The day of the hearing arrived, and Marcus flew to Washington, D.C., accompanied by Angela and a small group of supporters. As he walked into the grand chamber of the Capitol building, the weight of the moment hit him. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Marcus kept his focus on the task ahead. Inside, the room buzzed with anticipation. Senators sat behind a long desk, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The audience included industry leaders, civil rights advocates, and members of the public. Marcus took his seat at the witness table, his prepared statement in hand. The chairperson, Senator Maria Alvarez, began the hearing with a brief introduction. "Today, we're here to examine reports of systemic bias in the airline industry. Our first witness is Captain Marcus Reed, whose recent experience has sparked national attention. Captain Reed, you have the floor." Marcus adjusted the microphone, his heart pounding. "Thank you, Senator Alvarez and members of the committee. My name is Marcus Reed. I've been a commercial pilot for over 15 years, and I'm proud of my profession. But my recent experience exposed a problem that goes beyond me, one that affects countless individuals in the aviation industry and beyond." He recounted the incident on the flight, his voice steady but impassioned. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger issue, bias that makes people question someone's qualifications based on their appearance rather than their credentials." Marcus continued, outlining his recommendations for change: mandatory anti-bias training, increased diversity in leadership, and federal oversight to ensure accountability. "This isn't just about fairness," he concluded. It's about safety, trust, and the principles we claim to stand for as a nation. The room was silent as Marcus finished. Then Senator Alvarez leaned forward. Thank you, Captain Reed. Your testimony is both compelling and deeply concerning. I'd like to open the floor to questions. The questioning began politely but soon grew pointed. One senator, clearly skeptical, asked, Captain Reed, some might argue that your experience was an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than evidence of systemic bias. How do you respond? Marcus met the senator's gaze. I'd respond by saying that misunderstandings don't happen in a vacuum. They're shaped by implicit biases that go unchecked. My experience is one of many. Dismissing it as an isolated incident ignores the broader patterns that exist. The senator nodded, seeming satisfied. Another senator asked about the airline's response. Marcus praised the steps Skyways Airlines had taken but emphasized that voluntary efforts weren't enough. We need consistent, enforceable standards across the industry, he said. As the hearing continued, Marcus felt a growing sense of purpose. The senators were listening, and the audience seemed engaged. But just as he began to feel hopeful, his phone buzzed with a notification. Glancing at it discreetly, he saw a message that made his blood run cold. It was another threat. This time it included a photo of Marcus entering the Capitol building, accompanied by the words, "You're out of your depth. Last warning." Marcus's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain composed. He couldn't let fear derail him, not now. After the hearing, Marcus stepped outside to face a swarm of reporters. He answered a few questions before excusing himself, eager to escape the spotlight. Angela pulled him aside, her expression grim. What happened? You looked shaken toward the end. Marcus showed her the message. They're escalating. Angela's eyes narrowed. We need to get you more security. This isn't just intimidation. It's a calculated effort to silence you. I'm not stopping, Marcus said firmly. But I need to protect my family. Angela nodded. We'll make it happen. That evening, Marcus returned to his hotel, exhausted but resolute. As he sat in the quiet room, his phone buzzed with a call from Detective Cross. Captain Reed, we've got something, Cross said. One of the emails was traced to a private server connected to a former Skyways employee. We're investigating further, but this could be a breakthrough. Marcus felt a surge of hope. Do you think they're the one behind the threats? It's too early to say, Cross replied, but we're closing in. Marcus thanked him and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The threats were far from over, but the investigation was gaining traction. The next morning, headlines about the hearing dominated the news. Pundits debated the implications of Marcus's testimony, and social media buzzed with praise and criticism. Amid the noise, Marcus received an unexpected call from Langston, the CEO of Skyways Airlines. Captain Reed, I watched the hearing. Your testimony was powerful, Langston said. I'd like to discuss expanding your role on the advisory panel to include industry-wide initiatives. Marcus hesitated. The offer was tempting, but he knew it came with risks. Let's talk, he said cautiously. As the call ended, Marcus realized he was standing at another crossroads. The threats were escalating, the stakes were growing, and the path ahead was anything but clear. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. Just as he began to plan his next move, a knock at the door startled him. Marcus opened it cautiously, only to find a letter slipped under the door. He unfolded it, his heart sinking as he read the words, "You've crossed the line, time's up." Marcus knew the fight had just entered its most dangerous phase yet. Marcus stared at the letter, his chest tightening with fear and anger. The threat wasn't just a message anymore. It was a direct challenge. He quickly scanned the hallway outside his hotel room, but it was empty. Whoever had delivered the letter was already gone. He stepped back inside and locked the door. His hands trembled as he called Detective Cross. I just received another threat, Marcus said, his voice low but urgent. A letter slipped under my door at the hotel. Cross didn't hesitate. Stay in your room. Don't open the door for anyone unless it's law enforcement. I'm sending officers over right now. We'll secure the area and collect the letter for analysis. Marcus nodded, pacing the room as he waited. His mind raced with questions. How did they know where he was staying? Was his family still safe? He called Dana, relieved to hear her calm voice. "We're fine," she assured him. "The police are still keeping an eye on the house." "Good," Marcus said, though the knot in his stomach didn't ease. "Stay vigilant. I'll keep you updated." Within 20 minutes, 2 officers arrived, accompanied by a plainclothes detective. They carefully bagged the letter as evidence and inspected the hallway for signs of forced entry or surveillance. "We'll review security footage," the detective said. "If someone was caught on camera, we'll find them." Marcus thanked them, but his unease lingered. After they left, Angela called, her voice filled with concern. "Marcus, this is getting out of control. You need a full security detail." "I'm not sure I can afford that," Marcus replied. "I'm already stretching thin." "Don't worry about the cost," Angela insisted. "We'll cover it through our organization's resources. You're too important to this fight to be left vulnerable." Marcus hesitated and agreed. "Thank you. I'll take all the help I can get." The next morning, Angela's team arranged for 2 security professionals to accompany Marcus at all times. Their presence was both reassuring and unnerving. He appreciated the protection, but it was a constant reminder of the danger he faced. Despite the heightened security, Marcus refused to cancel his plans. That evening, he attended a town hall meeting hosted by a coalition of civil rights groups. The packed auditorium buzzed with energy as activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens gathered to discuss the systemic changes Marcus had called for. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stepped to the podium, his security detail standing discreetly nearby. He scanned the crowd, feeling both the weight of their expectations and the strength of their support. "This isn't about one airline or one industry," Marcus began. "It's about confronting the biases that exist in every corner of our society. It's about creating systems that value people for their skills and humanity, not the color of their skin." The crowd erupted in applause, their enthusiasm fueling Marcus's resolve. He spoke with passion, outlining his vision for change and urging the audience to join him in the fight. As he finished, a man in the back of the room stood up. His voice was loud and confrontational. "How do we know this isn't just a publicity stunt? You're getting a lot of attention, Captain Reed. What's in it for you?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Marcus. He met the man's gaze, his voice steady. "What's in it for me is the chance to leave the world better than I'd found it. I didn't choose to be in this position, but now that I am, I'm going to use it to make a difference." The man didn't reply, and the audience broke into cheers. Marcus stepped away from the podium, his heart pounding. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also reminded him of why he was there. After the event, Marcus returned to his hotel with his security team. As he entered his room, his phone buzzed with another notification. It was an email from an anonymous sender, and the subject line read, "Final Countdown." The message was chillingly brief. "You've been warned. Leave this fight or face the consequences." Marcus's stomach churned. He forwarded the email to Detective Cross, who replied quickly, "We're escalating the investigation. Keep your security detail close and don't go anywhere alone." Marcus closed his laptop, feeling the walls closing in. He thought about his family, his supporters, and the countless people who looked to him for hope. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had his resolve. The following day, Marcus received another call, this time from Senator Alvarez. "Captain Reed, I wanted to thank you for your testimony," she said. "It's already sparked discussions about new federal guidelines for anti-bias training in the airline industry." "That's great to hear, Senator," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked enthusiasm. "Are you all right?" Alvarez asked, sensing his hesitation. "I'm fine," Marcus lied. "Just tired." "Well, take care of yourself," Alvarez said. "We need your voice in this fight." After hanging up, Marcus sat in silence, the weight of the threats pressing down on him. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't back down. The opposition wanted him to be afraid, to retreat into silence. Instead, he resolved to push harder, to take the fight to new heights. Just as he began drafting another public statement, a loud knock at the door startled him. His security team immediately sprang into action, one of them peering through the peephole. "It's the hotel manager," the guard said, opening the door cautiously. The manager stepped inside, his face pale. "Captain Reed, we just received a call from someone claiming to know your location. They demanded that you leave the hotel immediately or else." The room fell silent as the manager's voice trailed off. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The fight had just taken a terrifying new turn, and the danger was now closer than ever. The hotel manager's words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Marcus's security detail exchanged tense glances before one of them spoke. "We're moving you now. This location isn't secure anymore." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. "Where do we go?" "There's a safe house not far from here," the lead guard said. "It's private and guarded. We'll get you there safely." The team worked quickly, gathering Marcus's belongings and coordinating the move. As they exited the hotel through a side entrance, Marcus scanned the parking lot, half expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The car ride to the safe house was tense, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine. The safe house was a nondescript building in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall trees that provided natural cover. Inside, the space was modest but secure, with reinforced locks, surveillance cameras, and an emergency phone line. Marcus settled in, though his nerves remained on edge. Angela called shortly after he arrived. "I heard about the threat at the hotel," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Are you okay?" "I'm safe for now," Marcus replied. "But this isn't letting up. They're escalating, and I don't know how much more I can take." "You've come too far to stop now," Angela said firmly. "But you don't have to face this alone. We're rallying more support. Activists, politicians, even some airline employees who've experienced similar discrimination. The movement is growing, Marcus." "I know," Marcus said, "but it feels like every step forward comes with a bigger risk." "That's how change happens," Angela said. "It's messy and dangerous, but it's worth it. You're making history, Marcus. Don't lose sight of that." Her words offered some comfort, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was looming. That night, Marcus struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house and rustle of the wind outside put him on edge. Around 2 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message contained a single word: "Checkmate." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He immediately forwarded the message to Detective Cross, who replied moments later, "Stay inside. We're tracing it now." A wave of frustration and anger surged through Marcus. Whoever was behind this wanted him to feel powerless, but he refused to give in. He opened his laptop and began drafting an op-ed for a major newspaper, determined to turn his fear into action. The next day, Marcus's op-ed was published under the headline, "Why I Refuse to Be Silenced." In it, he recounted his experience, the threats he faced, and his unwavering commitment to fighting for justice. The piece quickly went viral, drawing widespread support and sparking new conversations about bias and accountability in the airline industry. But the response wasn't entirely positive. While many praised Marcus's courage, others accused him of seeking attention or exaggerating his story. The criticism stung, but Marcus reminded himself that the fight wasn't about winning everyone over. It was about driving change. That afternoon, Marcus received a call from Langston, the CEO of Skyways Airlines. "Captain Reed, I read your op-ed," Langston said. "It's powerful, and it's sparking important discussions. I'd like to meet with you to discuss how Skyways can support your broader efforts." Marcus hesitated. The threats had made him wary of stepping into public spaces, but the opportunity to push for industry-wide changes was too important to pass up. "Let's do it," he said. "But I'll need the location to be secure." "Understood," Langston replied. "We'll arrange for it." The meeting was scheduled for the following day at a private conference room in a secure office building. Marcus arrived with his security team, his nerves on high alert. Langston greeted him warmly, accompanied by several executives from the airline. "Captain Reed, thank you for coming," Langston said. "We've been discussing ways to implement your recommendations not just at Skyways but across the industry." Marcus listened as Langston outlined a plan to collaborate with other airlines, advocacy groups, and government agencies to establish new standards for anti-bias training, diversity in leadership, and accountability measures. It was ambitious but promising. "This is a strong start," Marcus said, "but it needs to be more than just words. The industry has to commit to real, measurable change." "We agree," Langston said, "and we want you to play a central role in these efforts." Before Marcus could respond, one of the executives' phones buzzed. The man's face paled as he read the screen. "There's been an incident," he said, his voice tight. "What kind of incident?" Langston asked, his tone sharp. "A security breach," the executive replied. "Someone just hacked into our internal systems and leaked employee records to the press." The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. Marcus's heart sank. Was this connected to the threats against him? Or was it a sign that the fight was entering even more dangerous territory? Langston turned to Marcus, his expression grim. "This just got a lot more complicated. We need to figure out who's behind this, and fast." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. The stakes had just been raised, but he wasn't backing down. The fight was far from over, and the next move would be critical. The air in the conference room felt heavy with tension. The revelation of the security breach had thrown everyone off balance, but Marcus's mind was already racing. He couldn't ignore the timing. Someone was trying to destabilize the efforts he and the airline were making. Langston turned to his team. "We need to determine the extent of the breach and how it happened. I want a report on my desk within the hour." The executives hurried out, leaving Marcus, Langston, and a few others in the room. Langston sighed, rubbing his temples. "Captain Reed, I have to ask. Do you think this is connected to the threats you've been receiving?" "It's possible," Marcus admitted. "Whoever's behind this has been escalating their tactics. If they want to undermine the push for change, this would be a calculated move." Langston nodded, his expression grim. "I've already reached out to cybersecurity experts. We'll get to the bottom of this." Marcus returned to the safe house later that afternoon, his security detail maintaining a tight watch. He updated Angela about the breach, and her reaction was immediate. "This is no coincidence," she said. "They're trying to discredit you and the airline, but this could backfire on them if we handle it right." "How do we do that?" Marcus asked. "Transparency," Angela said. "The public already supports you. If we get ahead of this and show that we're committed to finding the truth, it'll strengthen your position." Marcus nodded, though he felt the weight of the mounting pressure. "I'll follow your lead." The next morning, Skyways Airlines held a press conference. Langston stood at the podium, flanked by Marcus and other executives. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones ready. Langston began, addressing the breach head-on. "Yesterday, our company experienced a security breach that resulted in a leak of sensitive employee records. We are working closely with law enforcement and cybersecurity experts to identify the source of this attack and ensure it does not happen again." He paused, then gestured toward Marcus. "This breach comes at a time when we are working to address systemic issues within our industry, issues brought to light by Captain Marcus Reed. We believe this attack is an attempt to disrupt those efforts, but let me be clear, we will not be deterred." Marcus stepped up to the microphone, his presence commanding. "This fight has always been about creating a fair and equitable system. Whoever is behind these threats and attacks wants to silence us, but they're only proving why this work is necessary. We won't back down." The reporters erupted with questions, but Langston ended the conference, promising further updates as the investigation unfolded. That evening, Marcus sat in the living room of the safe house, his mind restless. He thought about the risks he'd taken and the people who were counting on him. His phone buzzed with a call from Detective Cross. "We've made progress," Cross said. The breach was traced to an external server located overseas, but we found something interesting. It was facilitated by someone with insider access. Marcus's heart sank. An employee? Possibly a former one, Cross said. We're narrowing down suspects, but there's one name that stands out. A former IT contractor for Skyways who was terminated last year. His social media activity suggests a grudge against the company. Do you think he's connected to the threats? Marcus asked. It's too early to say, Cross replied. But we're treating him as a person of interest. We'll keep you updated. Marcus thanked him and hung up, feeling a mix of relief and dread. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture wasn't clear yet. The next day, Marcus received a call from Senator Alvarez. Captain Reed, I wanted to let you know that a bipartisan group of senators is drafting legislation based on the recommendations you made during your testimony. That's incredible news, Marcus said, a flicker of hope cutting through his anxiety. It's a testament to your courage and leadership, Alvarez said. But I want to warn you, there's already opposition from lobbyists and industry groups. They're claiming the proposed regulations are too burdensome. Marcus exhaled. I expected that, but I'm not giving up. Good, Alvarez said. We'll need your voice as we move forward. Stay strong, Captain. Later that evening, Marcus was reviewing his notes for an upcoming speaking engagement when his security detail knocked on the door. Captain, we have a situation, one of them said. Marcus's pulse quickened. What is it? There's a vehicle parked down the street. It's been there for over an hour, and the driver hasn't moved. We've alerted the police. Marcus felt a familiar knot of fear in his stomach. Do you think it's connected to the threats? It's possible, the guard said, but we're not taking any chances. Minutes later, a police cruiser arrived, its lights flashing. Officers approached the suspicious vehicle, and after a tense exchange, the driver was removed from the car. One of the officers approached Marcus's house to give an update. The driver claims he was just lost, the officer said. But his story doesn't add up. We're taking him in for questioning. Marcus nodded, though his unease lingered. The incident was another reminder that the fight he was waging came with real dangers. As the night wore on, Marcus tried to focus on the progress that had been made, the legislation, the growing support, the steps Skyways was taking. But the shadow of the threats loomed large, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous challenge was still ahead. He sat at his desk, staring at his phone. A new email notification appeared, and his heart sank as he read the subject line. Game over. The message contained no text, only an attachment. Marcus hesitated before opening it. His blood ran cold when he saw what it was. A detailed blueprint of the safe house, marked with a red X over his current location. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching, they were closing in. Marcus realized with chilling clarity that the fight had reached a breaking point. Marcus stared at the screen, the blueprint and its ominous red X searing into his mind. His chest tightened as fear gripped him, but he quickly shoved it aside, forcing himself to act. He forwarded the email to Detective Cross with a simple message. Urgent. They know where I am. Within minutes, Cross called. Captain Reed, stay calm. We're dispatching units to your location now. Do not leave the house unless instructed by your security detail. Marcus hung up and turned to his guards. They know where I am. Police are on their way, but we need to be ready for anything. The team sprang into action, securing doors and windows, checking surveillance feeds, and coordinating with law enforcement. Marcus paced the room, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this wasn't just sending threats. They were escalating to something far more dangerous. 15 minutes later, flashing lights illuminated the street as multiple police vehicles arrived. Officers surrounded the property, their radios crackling with updates. Detective Cross stepped inside, his expression grave. We traced the email, Cross said. It was sent from a device we believe belongs to the former IT contractor we're investigating. His name is Brian Harper. We have a team en route to his last known address, but we're treating this situation as an immediate threat. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. What do we do now? For now, we keep you here, Cross said. This house is secure, and we have officers stationed outside. But if anything seems off, we'll move you to another location immediately. The tension in the house was palpable as hours dragged by. Marcus tried to distract himself by reviewing updates from Angela and Langston, but his focus kept drifting back to the blueprint. How had Brian Harper obtained such detailed information? Was he acting alone, or was someone else pulling the strings? Just after midnight, a loud noise shattered the silence, a sharp metallic clatter from outside. Marcus's guards immediately drew their weapons, motioning for him to stay low. One of them checked the surveillance feed and cursed under his breath. "We've got movement in the backyard." Cross barked orders into his radio, and within seconds, officers were closing in on the back of the property. Marcus could hear the commotion, shouts, the rustle of footsteps, and finally the unmistakable snap of handcuffs. "Suspect apprehended," an officer reported through the radio. "He's armed but cooperative." Relief flooded through Marcus as Cross returned with an update. "It's Harper," he said. "We've got him in custody. He had a weapon and what looks like a key to this property. We'll know more after questioning." The immediate threat was neutralized, but Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. The next morning, Cross provided more details. Harper admitted to sending the threats and planning an attack on your safe house. He claims he acted alone, but we're still investigating his connections. "Why would he target me?" Marcus asked. "He blames Skyways for his termination and saw your campaign as a convenient target," Cross explained. "He believed disrupting your efforts would harm the airline." Marcus shook his head, a mix of anger and sadness coursing through him. One man's vendetta could have cost lives. "It's over now," Cross said. "You're safe." With Harper in custody, Marcus finally had a moment to breathe. But as he reflected on the ordeal, he realized the threats had only solidified his resolve. If anything, they had underscored the importance of his fight. He reached out to Angela and Langston to discuss next steps. Together, they planned a public statement addressing the events and reaffirming their commitment to change. Days later, Marcus stood before a crowd of supporters and journalists. Cameras flashed as he spoke, his voice steadied and resolute. "What I've faced over the past weeks has been terrifying, but it's nothing compared to what countless people endure every day in silence," Marcus said. "This isn't just my fight. It's ours, and we won't let fear stop us from demanding a fairer, more just world." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy invigorating Marcus. He stepped down from the podium, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Months later, the legislation Marcus had helped inspire was signed into law, mandating anti-bias training and stricter accountability measures across the airline industry. Skyways implemented sweeping changes, and other airlines began to follow suit. Marcus became a prominent advocate for equity and justice, balancing his work as a pilot with his role as a changemaker. Though the threats had left scars, they had also forged a stronger, more determined version of himself. As he boarded a flight one evening, the passengers stopped him in the aisle. "Captain Reed," the man said, extending a hand, "I just want to thank you for everything you've done. You've made a difference." Marcus smiled, shaking the man's hand. "Thank you," he said. "But there's still work to do." He continued to the cockpit, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The fight had tested him in ways he never imagined, but he had emerged stronger, ready to soar to new heights, not just for himself, but for everyone who shared the dream of a better world.